Alright guys, in this video we are going to learn a little bit about testing components that have inputs and outputs. And what that means exactly is something we're going to simulate in our testing application. And once we know what that is, we'll go ahead and figure out how to test those things. So let's navigate to the code base and let me go to the app module here and let's see, how can we simulate this scenario? In our application, what we have is just a couple of dummy components. If we load our app in the browser, let's reload this here. So it's just some text here. What I need to do to simulate the scenario of components having inputs and outputs, I need to generate some dummy components here where one of those will have those inputs and outputs. So let me start from ng-CLI and let me clear this pane here. And let's see, I'm going to generate a new component. I'll call it, let's pretend this is a to-do app, right? And we'll have a component. So I'll say ng generate component, and the component will be, let's say, to-do list. All right, and that to-do list component will list to-dos using other components specifically designed to list an individual to-do. So I'm going to create another component that will be called to-do list item that will be used inside of to-do list in the way that you're going to see just in a second. So go in the code base and then open our newly generated to-do list here. And in its template, we're just going to use that. I'm going to demonstrate the example of how you would use another component, which will be to-do list item. And I'm just going to stick a three of these, all right? And then I need to update app HTML component to use app to-do list component like that. So in our main application component, we use to-do list, and inside of to-do list, we list individual to-do items. Let's see, we should see three of these guys displaying in our application. And there they are. If you look at the template of one of those individual components, that's the exact string you're going to see, exactly what we see in the app. All right, now we have a component that uses another component, and where inputs and outputs come into play is when to-do list here needs to specify, or we provide the ability for the to-do list component to specify the name of individual to-do item. So for example, we want to say that the name that the to-do list item component should display as the to-do is something that we want to pass into it. So let's say it'll be to-do 1. And let me just remove these, and that is the input property. Now this is highlighted red because it doesn't exist yet on the to-do list item component. So let's go ahead and create one. So to create an input property, you need to use input decorator. So let me import it from Angular core. You see it appeared on top. All right, and then I call it just as a function. And then after I specify the name of the input property, and remember in our template here, we call this name just like that. So here I'll say name, and that's it. All right, let's see what is highlighted. Nothing is highlighted, so I think this should work. So what we should see in the app now is just a single item that says to do 1. And it's not, because I remember now that we need to update the template of to-do list item component to use that property that we pass through the input. So here I'll just specify the name that we're passing through the component. Reload the app, and now it should show to do 1. Right? And the same idea applies to using multiple components like this. Let's say this is to do 2, and we should see to do 2. This looks good. And that's for the input property. Now, before I move on onto the output property, actually, this is fine. Let's talk about output property. Now, what is output used for? Usually it is to detect some whatever events happening inside of the component. Now, let's say this is my to-do list component right here, right? I want to subscribe or monitor, or whatever the terminology you use. I want to listen to the events that happen inside of the to-do list item component, and I want my callback function in this component, in the parent component, to execute whenever something happens inside of the list. So for example, if I go inside of the list item component here, let's say this is sitting in a div, right? Or maybe, you know what, maybe this is even a button. For whatever reason, this is a button, and then button is clickable, right? You can do a click on the button like this, and then let's say if it clicks, then I want to say that the button will trigger an event. Now let's see, let me copy an implementation of the output property here. Output property, that's how you declare output property in the component. So let me copy this and use it right here next to the input property, and I'll call it clicked. All right, and it will be, let me import this output statement from, I need to make sure I import it from Angular core, just like this, and then import event emitter also from Angular core. And now this will be just anything like that. So now I have this event emitter, and when I detect a click on this button, I say that, let me find the implementation here as well. I want to say, all right, that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to copy this method, and here I'll say that I want to execute this method, and then I'm going to add this method as I just copied from Angular guide. So now I'll just use the proper naming of the output property, and I'll say emit, and what I'm going to emit is, I'll just say, I'll emit a string that says clicked. Okay, now let's see if this is highlighting anything, and it doesn't. This looks good. Now I created this output property on the child component, right, on to-do list item. Now let's go to the parent component that uses that, and what I can do here now is to bind to this newly introduced clicked output property, and now whenever that is clicked and new event is emitted, as a result of this, I can sort of subscribe to it and call my own method from to-do list component, and let's say the method will be to-do clicked, something like this. And now I need to introduce this method, so I go to the controller of this component, and I'll say to-do clicked, and it will accept event property, and then in the body I'll just console log whatever is the event. And I think this should do it. Let's display this button. Let's pop the console here, and when I click on it, it says undefined. It should say clicked. Oh, I think it's because when I bound to the clicked output property of individual item here, I didn't pass the event like that, because that's what contains the string that's being outputted here or emitted. Alright, so let's reload that. Now click, and now we see the clicked event. And remember, this console log is executed in the parent, in the to-do list component right here, not in the child. So now we have all that input and output set up in the real world almost. And what we need to do is figure out how to test this stuff. Now what we have is testing of the item component, right? Or actually, let's go and see what Angular guide says about testing these kind of things. So let's see, first in the beginning they described what input and output properties are and how they could work. We did the same thing with our to-do simulation app. And now they say that there are 3 strategies that you can use to test these input and output behavior or sort of interface of your child component. First is that you would test it as part of the parent component. So what they suggest in the first option is that I write tests for the parent controller. So parent controller is the to-do list, and that's its test. I open that, and in these tests I will let these tests render individual to-do list items, just like here. So in a test, it will let render whatever is happening inside of each individual item. So if you output whatever is being rendered in the template as part of the test for this component, you will see actual stuff from the template of this component. So you will see these individual buttons. And that's one way to do it, but the problem with that, as they describe here, it is discouraging to do that because these parent components, let's go to our parent here, to the to-do list here. If we look at the controller right now, it looks super simple. This is a super simple component, but in reality, these parent components are usually pulling in a bunch of services, routing, and all other stuff. And if you try to test the behavior of your input and output properties in these child components, like let's see in this test right here, you will need to do a lot of setup and it'll be a pain in the ass. So that's why it is discouraged. And the second strategy they offer is to test the input and output functionality of your child component as a standalone component. So you will not write tests in the parent component here, but you will write tests in the child component. And that makes sense because you're testing functionality of this child component with its inputs and outputs. And it makes sense to write tests inside of that component. So what is about this approach specifically? Let's see if there are any examples of them doing that. So that's a standalone, that's an example. And I think the main difference is in the way how you set input and output binding. If we look at the real usage of the child component, let's go to the parent and see how it uses it in the template here. You see how it uses the component and binds whatever properties it uses for input and output. In the test, in the second testing strategy, there won't be anything like this. There won't be like a square bracket setting property or the parentheses binding to the event output. Instead, what they're doing here is they're grabbing, so in the test, right here in the to-do list item tests, you would grab the reference to the component, here it is, and then you would set these input and output properties name and clicked directly using the reference to the component. And here, that's what they do. They grab the reference to the component in this comp variable right here, okay? And then they set this input property, as in their case is hero. They set it to whatever, they're testing mocked stuff, which is this one in this case. And then they make assertions against expected behavior. So let's do the same thing real quick and see what happens. So let's simulate this second approach, second option. So we have our component reference here, right? And before I'm going to extract detect changes statement from here to here into my test to make it more explicit. And then I'm going to use the reference to the component as they do. And then I reference to the input property, which is the name. And I'll set the name of the to-do. I'll say to-do1, just like we do in our app in the parent component. But this is the test. And then I will assert that the fixture, which contains the rendered HTML of the component, that in the native element I'm going to query for the element that is, I think it's just a single div that we have, right? Oh no, actually it is a button. Okay, so it is a button. I'm going to query for that button, and once I get the reference, I'll say that the text content inside of that button should be, so it's to be to do one, just like I said in the input property here. And remember, whenever the input property is set like that, right here, in the template, it is just directly outputted as the button name. So that's why when in the test I'm querying for the button, and when I'm looking what's inside of there, I expect there to be what exactly I mocked in here. Now let's try to execute that in the test and see what happens. Is it going to pass? Okay, here it says that it cannot bind to name since it is a not known property of to-do list item. I'm not sure if that's related to the test we're trying to run, so to make sure we only see failures related to this test, I'm going to exclude it using the F designation here. Rerun that. And that's passing. All right, that failure was to some other test unrelated to that. Our explicit test here is passing. So that is the point of how you use standalone approach for testing input properties in your components. Now let's see what's the third approach. And if we go back to the original list among these, right? So we reviewed first one and then standalone, and then using a substitute for the parent component to test property binding. Now, what is this third part about? If you scroll a little bit, they dedicate an entire section in this guide to show how to test in this particular strategy. So I'm just going to scroll down here. And let's see, do I need anything from here? Yeah, I'm going to copy this part here. Now this looks like this is component controller implementation, but it's not. Well, actually it is, but the trick is that we are going to declare a completely separate component, but we are doing it in our test. So that's pretty cool. So I'm going to copy that and then go to our existing test, and then before the describe statement, I'm going to paste that thing where we are creating or declaring a separate component, just like we do in other components. Like if you look at the controller of this component that we are testing, it looks exactly like this. We use component decorator and then the class, and class represents the component. So we're doing exactly the same thing, but just in our test to create a new component. And what we're going to call new component, I'm just going to call this test host, just like this. Test host. Okay. Or no, actually, no. What I need in this template is to use the component that we are testing, and the component that we are testing is, again, it is app to do list item. All right, so that's what I'm going to reference in the template of this dummy host component, so that in here I render the component that I'm testing. And remember, so the property that we have is name, and then here I'll say that it's supposed to be to do one, and forget about selected for now. All right, and I don't think I need any of this, at least for now. All right, and so I declared this test host component that inside of it is trying to use the component that we're testing, and it's binding the this input property and specifying the value for it as just a string to do one. All right, this component is declared, but I need to make sure that it's also declared during it's also declared in the test bed that runs these tests. Otherwise, it just will not work. And now what I'm trying to do here is I'm not going to I'm going to remove this mocking. We are no longer specifying the name input property by directly setting it in the component like this. So I'm going to remove that. Remember, we are doing it through property binding, which is sort of a step up in testing the entire functionality of the component, is that the property binding actually works correctly, and that's an important part of this entire component that we're testing, because if that's not working, then the component will not work. In the previous approach, we were setting this name directly, and that's sort of a hack just to make testing easier, but it's not testing the whole thing. That's the main point in the third approach, because it introduces more comprehensive testing. Now we have this host component executing the template with the component we're testing, right? And we pass the to do, and we have detect changes run, and then fixture. So I think what I need to do is I need to update this statement where we're creating component is to use the host test host component like this, and then I need to update the signature of the fixture like this, and now I also update signature of this component like this, and now fixture contains the reference to the actual host component that contains this template. All right, that makes sense. And then I'm still querying this fixture against the button, and that it has to do one value. So I think this all just should work. Let's see. And it does. Look at this. From the first time it worked as the third approach of testing the component with input and output properties. Now this is running a little bit over time, so I'm not going to cover the testing output properties, but maybe we'll do it in the next video.